So the way this is run is typically I ramble for an hour, then you get a short break, and then we do discussion, questions, answers. And I typically am good about covering the topics that are advertised for the course. And I promise you I will talk about the topics advertised for the course, only not today. For those of you who didn't hear the President's speech today, it was the most extraordinary speech at the United Nations since the founding of the United Nations. And I want to take, without just sort of summarizing the speech, I want to take some of the topics and put them in some kind of historical and contemporary context, which also sets up for future discussions of the various other topics, because as all of you know from reading anything or listening to anything on TV, in general everybody's talking about the destruction of global governance or the demise of global governance, as well as democracy being under threat, etc. So those are hardly my inventions as topics for discussion. But what I want to do this morning is to sort of be the poor man and woman's, Christiane Amanpour or something like that, and comment on what he was talking about. Besides, he opens the talk by praising himself and the United States. Never in the history of the United States has anybody done so many good things for the U.S. We're in the best shape we've ever been, economically, politically, culturally, name it. It's never been this wonderful before. That's how it started. But more to the point for this course was the fact that the essential message was the following. Global governance is a fraud. It has come to an end. It's not just America first, but it should be every state first. What we should value is sovereignty, and sovereignty means you don't have to, or you should not, or you can't, or you will not pay any attention to any of the governing structures that have developed over centuries in the world. You don't give an inch or anything to any institution whatsoever, because we are autonomous states. No one tells the U.S. what to do. The U.S. will look out for itself and no one else, and every other state in the world should do likewise. And then he added a couple of comments at the end about how, wonderful the United Nations is, and what an important institution it is. But because they do so many wrong things, we are cutting the budgets for the United Nations. We are have already left and may leave some other intergovernmental institutions of which we are a member, and we will certainly stop funding many of the institutions of related to the United Nations. So essentially, we're out for ourselves, and everybody else should be out for themselves, and then somehow this will be in the interest of all of us and the world. He did obviously praise ourselves as the virtuous countries, but he also mentioned several other countries as also ranking high amongst the virtue of states. One is Saudi Arabia, the other is Poland, the third is Israel, and I think those were the three. And then he spent a good deal of time condemning Iran as the worst possible country in the world. Oh yeah, the fourth is North Korea. So he praised North Korea, Poland, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and he condemned Iran, and then went back to praising ourselves. So that's what the President of the United States had to say to the international community today. As the camera spanned, for those of you who weren't watching, I apologize for those who watched it. At the beginning, when he was praising the U.S. and so forth, people laughed. In the beginning. There's never been a president who's been laughed at before at the United Nations. And as he was picking on countries and as being virtuous and not being virtuous, cameras focused on, representatives, presidents, and so forth, snickering and looking at each other. But I doubt that he noticed it. So, let's discuss where we've been and where we seem to be right now. And I apologize that I'm going to repeat a few things that some of you have heard me say before. The so-called sovereign nation state, which according to our president should be more sovereign and should have a hard shell around it, evolved over some centuries, starting in the 17th century, as countries slowly moved away from city-states, territorial states, empires, and all kinds of other conformations of political organization. And the idea of the sovereign nation state came more or less more seriously into fruition in the late 19th century and then in the 20th century. And the idea was a dual idea. First, the state was referred to as a legal entity, a confined space with borders, with a government that had the capacity to govern and so on. So in the technical sense, a state is a legal entity, okay? Now, how do you get to be a state? Essentially by having the characteristics of a border and a government that can govern, but equally importantly, other already existing states have recognized that you are a state. In other words, they allow you into the family of states. Now, I say this because there have been groups of people who have declared themselves states and they were not internationally recognized, right? So you have to be recognized. How would we know this nowadays? Typically, the flag gets hoisted in front of the United Nations, right? And there are now almost 200 states. Right. Now, the idea of sovereignty meant originally that the sovereign, the king or whatever, had control, right? In more modern times, sovereignty is often meant to reside in the people rather than in royalty or in a particular individual. Sovereignty is how it's managed differs a little bit from country to country. Sometimes it's parceled out amongst a group of people, but in any event, there is an individual or a group of individuals who are said to be in charge of controlling what's inside the state. Okay. Nation is thrown around and used very often as a substitute for state, but nation is meant to be a group of people who believe themselves to belong together. A group of people who believe themselves to belong together. And that belonging together or believing in yourself to belong together can be for any number of reasons: religion, history, language, all kinds of things, and all combinations of things. And in modern times, there have been states that are fairly homogeneous. That is to say, the people inside those sovereign states are all more or less of the same ethnic origin. They speak the same language. They've had the same history and so forth. But there also have been multinational sovereign states, right, where the feeling of belonging together is not that you're similar in terms of religion or ethnicity or any of those characteristics, but rather because you have bought in to the state. That is to say, you want to be a member of that state. So what would be an example of of a fairly homogeneous state? Well, many of the states of Europe, the Scandinavian states, Germany, France, England, and so forth, which historically were fairly homogeneous in terms of their population, the language they spoke, and so forth. Sometimes they differed in terms, had multiple religions, and so forth. What are examples of multinational states? Well, the United States, Canada, Australia, and so forth, where from the very beginning the idea was that people, very disparate people, would come together, and what would make them feel like a nation was a commitment to that particular state. People would say, well, I'm Polish American or I'm Brazilian American, but I'm American. The American part was attached to it. You bought into your citizenship in the United States and you felt American, and that felt differently, and you believed that should feel differently than if you were Australian, let's say, or something else. Okay? So at the switch over to the nation state, some states were hyphenated nation states. That is to say, the state embodied a group of people who thought themselves to be a nation. And some states were sovereign states, but the hyphen between the two, or the line between the two, was more porous, because they were multinational or people didn't yet quite belong together and so forth. And that accelerated with the decolonization at the end of World War II, because late in the 19th century, the dominant countries in the world, Germany, France, England, so forth, Belgium, carved up 2/3 of the world into colonies. And they carved them up by looking at a map and making drawings and saying, this is a border here and there. So when countries became decolonized, most of Africa, much of Asia, and so forth, they became sovereign states. That is to say, the colonial power handed over the sovereignty and the authority to national actors, to state actors. But inside those boundaries, there were multinational identities. People had not yet achieved a sense of being, I don't know, Nigerian or Congolese or any number of other things in Asia, Vietnamese, Cambodians, whatever. The lines were not that clear, okay? So that the idea of a nation state has historically been an ideal that some states represented, but a goal for many other states, which is one of the reasons why some of these colonies have so many civil conflicts, ethnic conflicts, trying to divide up, groups trying to separate, and so forth, because they feel that they're caught inside a state in which they really don't belong. They want their own state, right? And that's a whole topic onto itself. In any event, by the time you get to the 20th century, you have the notion that sovereign states should be nation states or should aspire to being nation states. And you have the idea that the control of policy is up to the governing structure of that particular state. That's actually never been true. It's something we all learned in elementary school, this last part, because it's actually not really quite true. So let me talk about a few things like trade, the development of institutions, laws, and so forth, to show how we got here and what the problem is about trying to unravel this. I was reminded of the ancient roots of some of the ideas of entities getting together in a cooperative fashion when we were in Bergen, Norway this summer, where there are 2 square blocks, roughly speaking, of wooden buildings that are now tourist sites, but were the headquarters for centuries of a segment of something called the Hanseatic League, which started in the 12th century. And in their days, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, what it was, there weren't nation states, or for that matter, modern states, they were cities. And the cities decided that along the North Sea and the Baltic, that there was such a mess trading amongst themselves, that they ought to organize themselves in a trading organization, which was somewhere of a, let's say, embryonic mixture of the European Union, the World Trade Organization, and a few other things. That is to say, they decided in order not to have conflict at sea or conflict trading with each other, they should have rules, they should have laws, they should adhere to it, and it would make trading much more peaceful, less conflictual, and was in everybody's interest. Right? These were city-states. There are also semblance of this in ancient Greece and so forth. But in any event, this is Europe and modern Europe. So what started centuries ago of cities getting together in trade patterns was, I leave a big gap here, but was revisited, really, at the end of the Second World War, when the then sovereign states, mostly Europe, Western Hemisphere, and so forth, in the 1960s developed a General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade called GATT, which was supposed to set up rules for trading. And the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade actually developed a fair number of rules, regulations, which states, sovereign states, voluntarily adhered to because it made trading smoother, less conflictual, set some rules, made countries feel that they weren't taken advantage of because everybody had to adhere to the rules and so forth. The General Agreement of Tariff and Trade in the modern era, starting in 1995, morphed into the World Trade Organization, WTO, right? WTO was attacked by Trump this morning as a worthless body which was not doing anything in the interest of the United States, which was not monitoring trade positively, and he got very close to threatening our leaving the World Trade Organization. Okay? Now, the World Trade Organization is a very complex, and I won't bore you here with the details, organization, but most countries in the world are members, and most countries in the world have aspired to be members. And one of the things that Trump attacked was the fact that when China joined the World Trade Organization, which of course he thinks they shouldn't join to begin with, was the beginnings of China taking huge advantage of the United States and everybody else. Well, there are problems with trade with China, and we can talk about those later, but the idea of having China join the World Trade Organization was the idea of time immemorial, which is it's better to have somebody in your tent and try to get them to behave properly than not having them in your tent and feeling free to do any stupid thing they want to do, right? So all the other countries were very anxious to have China join because it was a way of regularizing China's trade policy with the rest of the world, right? And to have it be part of the rules of the system. I might just add, I'm editorializing here, of course, that when there is a dispute, that is to say country X versus country Y, let's say the United States and steel against saying somebody has unfair steel practices. First, there are negotiations within the World Trade Organization, but eventually there is a judicial system in the World Trade Organization where judges then take the evidence of the conflicting parties and make some kind of decision. Right? Since Trump has come into power, not only have we been unwilling to submit trade disputes to the World Trade Organization, but furthermore, we have refused to appoint new judges to it's like the Supreme Court or something, to appoint new judges so that the judicial branch is increasingly not able to function. In other words, we're doing everything in our power before even leaving to unravel the potency of that particular organization. Okay? So in addition, of course, to these global mechanisms, global trade mechanisms, that we know about, like the World Trade Organization. There are many other multilateral organizations of one kind or another that deal with trade and trade-related stuff. Commerce, control of various kinds of shipping, airlines, and so forth, which have much to do with the smoothing of the trade. In contemporary forms also, subgroups of states have seen the logic of coordinating and homogenizing trade and economic commerce. The European Union, common markets in every part of the world, the attempt of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right, which we have destroyed. As we have said we wouldn't join it and haven't signed, and now many other countries have decided to go ahead anyway with the Trans-Pacific Partnership because they see the logic of cooperative trade patterns, cooperative investments, and so forth. So other countries very often nowadays continue to try to make the system work even without the United States. And what's noteworthy, of course, was that the United States used to be the leader in these enterprises. And now we are not just not the leaders anymore, but we're throwing monkey wrenches into the system everywhere we can possibly think of. Okay, so that's trade. Now let's take the legal order that is also being attacked. All right. If you're going to have rules, you need a legal structure, right? And many of these institutions have, as I just mentioned with the World Trade Organization, internal legal structures. That is to say, they can, in fact, have a judicial hearing for a conflict within the parameters of the institution and that subject matter. But also starting in the 19th century was the idea to formalize something called international law. And international law, I won't repeat it all, as some of you heard me say before, started really in a serious fashion in the sort of 17th century, 18th century, when scholars put together documents, books actually, saying what the prevailing international law is as practiced by the existing political units. So, for example, the earliest text on international law was a book on the law of war and the law of the sea. Right? Why? Because when shipping was how people moved around, it was obviously a good idea not just to have rules so that ships wouldn't bump into each other and would, have a conflict out there, but it was also useful to have these rules written out so that if new actors or new states came into being, or somebody wasn't sure what the rule was, there was some place to look which told you what the rules were. Right? And what were most transactions up to the 20th century about? They were, in fact, that were serious, they were, in fact, rules having to do and transactions having to do with the sea and with warfare. Right? And warfare was also very important to stipulate so that people knew that if somebody raised a white flag, what it would mean, and what you could do and could not do to your opposing soldiers and things of that nature. By the time these kind of rules evolved, there were different origins of them. Originally, the idea was that you would stipulate the rules that echoed how states normally behaved. Eventually, by the time you get to the 20th century, the idea arose that you could also legislate international law. That is to say, you could contrive new rules for new subjects, which would be legislated and didn't just evolve out of the air over centuries. Okay? So, increasingly in the 20th century, international law expanded because new treaties were developed, and then countries would adhere to those, and those then became the norms, whether it had to do with airline traffic, or it had to do with new technologies, or had to do with any dangerous substances, whatever the case may be. And in addition, the new rules of the 20th and 21st century was that the charters of international institutions would themselves be international law. That is to say, they would stipulate how the states who are members would behave, how much they owe to the organization, what the rights were of their membership, what obligations the membership have, and so forth. So if you look at international law now, you see much international law which is based on the customs of behavior over centuries. You see more international law that is written up in various kinds of treaties for a particular subject matter. And then you can look at the charter of regional and international institutions and saying they too are a body of international law. So then the question is, who adjudicates all of that? And starting in the late 19th century, then very much in the beginning of the 20th century, there was the development of the International Court of Justice, which is located in The Hague, which was a court which states could go to if they had a conflict with another state and they wanted that conflict adjudicated. What kind of conflicts are we talking about here? We're talking about, let's say, border disputes. We're talking about disputes on the high seas and so forth, where I accuse you and you accuse me, and we are members of this court, and either she or I can bring the matter to the court, and the court adjudicates that, and then we have committed ourselves to adhere to that adjudication. In addition, in the 20th century, in the 1970s, they developed the International Court, the International Criminal Court, also located in The Hague. And the International Criminal Court came into being in 2002, I believe, and it was meant to be a court where individuals, not states, individuals could be charged for violating international law. What kind of violation? Human rights violations, for example, right? I have been discriminated against. I have been mistreated in some sense. Genocide has been committed against my people, right? I am a dictator who has ordered genocide. All those kinds of crimes can be brought in front of the International Criminal Court. Not states, but individuals for their wrongdoing. Now the question, of course, is in the International Court of Justice, who falls under that system? All the member states who've joined. By the way, the U.S. is a member of the International Court of Justice. In the International Criminal Court, who falls under its authority? Well, anybody who is an individual or any government who has been a signature of the treaty setting up the International Criminal Court. Okay. Now, I am a member of the International Criminal, my country is a member of the International Criminal Court. I can bring, I don't know why I keep picking on you, I can bring her to the court even though her country is not a member, right? Her country doesn't have to be a member. My country has to be a member, or vice versa, okay? In addition, the Security Council of the United Nations can bring a charge. It can vote. That doesn't happen very often because the US or somebody always vetoes the idea. Okay? So, for example, if the Security Council brings a charge against a country that is not a member of the International Criminal Court, that charge still stands against the individual, the head of state, or whatever. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, where does this U.S. stand on the International Criminal Court? It hasn't joined, right? Why? Because the U.S. and the Congress and so forth believes that no one has a right to charge somebody, some American. We're a sovereign country and we're the only ones that can charge somebody. The argument was made, for example, that an American soldier can be charged with a violation of murder of an innocent person or having overreacted as a soldier or something. All right. And the idea is that the U.S. and only the U.S. can try that soldier for wrongdoing. It shouldn't be the International Criminal Court. Now, when the International Criminal Court was set up, there was the idea that that might happen. And therefore, what it says in the Charter of the International Criminal Court is that if a country is willing to try its own citizen for wrongdoing, then the International Criminal Court will not kick in. So the country that is a member has the first right to try the individual. So if the U.S. says, yes, you're charging this soldier, we will bring that soldier to justice, right? Then the International Criminal Court doesn't kick in. So you get first rights, in a sense. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay, why am I going through this song and dance? Because there is this legal structure. There are also regional legal structures that are similar. There's a European Human Rights Court, for example, right? Okay, why are there objections to these? Well, Trump, no one touches Americans or anything Americans do, right? You can't, and in any event, we're not a member of the International Criminal Court, right? What's interesting about Trump is not that he is claiming we have rights in the court. What he is claiming is that we will oppose anything the court is doing and actively fight against the International Criminal Court doing its duty. Right? So we're not a member, but as a matter of policy, we are and will and increasingly will oppose the functioning of the International Criminal Court by throwing monkey wrenches into the system. So are there am I just sort of talking airy-fairy academic stuff here now? No, there are real cases right now. For example, the military in Myanmar and Burma, has been charged with genocide against the Rohingya, right? You've all read about that, okay? And Myanmar is not a member of the International Criminal Court. However, Bangladesh is. So Bangladesh is taking this issue to the International Criminal Court. Okay? There are charges against violations of human rights in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a member of the International Criminal Court, and they're trying to press charges. Now, in both those cases, the International Criminal Court is at the investigatory stage. That is, there hasn't been a trial. But you can see how this can morph, right? And capture countries or peoples or leaders and so forth in various kinds of nets. Well, President Trump says we don't want any part of this, go away. President Trump is not the only one. One of the reasons people voted for Brexit in England was because the right or the pro-Brexit people and the right in England do not want any cases of English people adjudicated in the European Human Rights Court. That is one of their strong arguments, right? Which is quite interesting, actually, when you think about it. And the European Human Rights Court, in contrast to the very few cases that have been coming in front of these global courts for a variety of reasons, has actually been quite active over the years. For example, years ago, soldiers women in England charged the English government with sexism and violation of the human rights for not allowing women soldiers, right, and discriminating against women in the military. The English said the military has a perfect right to only have men in their military. These women took it to the European Human Rights Court, who ruled against England. And England very obediently started admitting women for the court. So one of the things about the Human Rights Court, which is a closer and narrower court, has been that up until now, the members of the European Human Rights Court have adhered to the judgments of the European Human Rights Court, even when it was against government policy. So it's actually a fairly big success story. But it now means that countries, populists in England and Poland and whatever else, want out, right? Because they're saying, like Trump is saying, no one should impose themselves on our sovereign right. We deal with our populations and what we're doing. No one else has any rights out there. Right? So you have this evolution over centuries of international law, legal structures on a global scale and on a regional scale. And we've come to the point, first time in American history since the Second World War, of a president standing up and saying, we want any part of this, we want out. And you have leaders and opposition leaders in other Western countries and democracies also saying they want out and making this a reason for wanting out. In other words, let's restore old-fashioned sovereignty with a hard shell around the state. No one dare tell us what the hell we should be doing here. So then you have, where are my time-wise? Then you have, since in the 20th century, and very much more so in the post-World War II period, the development of multi-purpose, endless numbers of international organizations. You'd be amazed, 3,000 of them and more. Of every imaginable little subject matter, they are international institutions. And I'm now talking about intergovernmental institutions. Governments belong to these, managing the most obscure little things and major things and so forth. That has gotten the general tag of, in part, of global governance, because countries have decided that it was effective to have these structures, so you don't have to have a conflict about whether an airplane can land here, there, or what the criteria are. And if there is an issue at all, this particular institution has the resources, it has the technical know-how and so forth to advise, and then people listen to it. So you have this huge structure of intergovernmental institutions. Underneath that, you have this huge regional structure of intergovernmental institutions. Hundreds of institutions that regional groupings belong to. And parallel to that, you have a huge structure, again, thousands of organizations of so-called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that play various roles in global governance. From something like the International Red Cross, which has formal role in warfare, to something like Amnesty International, which looks out after human rights for people everywhere, which does not have the same kind of structure that the International Red Cross does, to ma and pop operations or the monies of various rich individuals who tried, the Gateses and so forth, who try to do good here, there, and yonder in health and welfare, in the environment, and so forth. Many of these institutions, over the last 30 years anyway, have operated as non-governmental institutions, but have received money from governments to do the work. So that the line has become porous between what, let's say, the USAID, our aid organization, is a governmental arm of the United States. But much of what it does overseas is contracted out to these non-governmental organizations who are thought to have the expertise to handle things. I could do a whole critique on that system, but I won't bore you with that today. But in any event, that's the structure. Okay, so that too is part of the global governance structure. And the third leg is multinational corporations, which, by the way, are not often multinationals. Everybody used to run around the 60s and 70s saying multinationals, multinationals. There are actually very few multinational corporations, because a real multinational corporation is owned by more than one nation, more than one state. Most corporations are owned by individuals from a single state and are active transnationally, right? Shell BP is a multinational corporation, right? Google is a transnational corporation. And by the way, that difference also exists in non-governmental organization. Most non-governmental organizations are transnational. They are organizations in a single country that operate internationally. A few non-governmental organizations like Amnesty and like Greenpeace are genuinely multinational. That is to say, their national headquarters and their branches are run nationally and not from the center. So that's a little confusing, but it matters, okay? So, is President Trump, or did President Trump say anything about global governance today? Sure. Let's get rid of it, essentially. That is to say, it has done us no good. We've been taken by the world since the Second World War. The world has disadvantaged us. We have paid a huge disproportion of the budgets of all these institutions, right? And what do? They criticize us, they vote against us, we want out. We're going to do our own thing. And every other country should do its own thing. In other words, encouragement for Brexit and populists elsewhere. Do your own thing. Stop being part of an international system. And then for good measure at the end he says, oh, the UN is a good organization, we should. 10 minutes earlier he had said, let's cut the budget of all of these institutions. Okay. So it's not just that global governance has come unraveled over the decades, and it certainly didn't start with Trump for a variety of reasons, but that Trump has now come firmly down on, we're not going to reform this stuff. What the reform is going to be each state on its own. Right. And insofar as trade is concerned, what Trump says, we're now going to have bilateral treaties. Never mind this international treaty stuff, bilateral treaties. And he proudly announced that we have a new bilateral treaty with South Korea. We do indeed. It was just signed. And it really advantages the United States. It has doubled the number of cars that the South Koreans American cars should purchase. Right? It says that clearly, from 25, I don't know, 1,000, 100, I don't know, whatever, million, to 50 of whatever the quality was. The odd thing about this is, if you look at it carefully, and I'm just giving you this one illustration, is that the previous quota of cars purchased, American cars purchased by Korea, did not ever get filled. So when it was 25, it never got filled. Now we doubled it to 50. It's unlikely the Koreans will all of a sudden triple the number of American cars they're going to buy, right? So much of that treaty is either just confirms what existed anyway, or makes stupid statements about what's going to happen, which is totally unrealistic in terms of the relationship of the trade, okay? What was the world looking for? What is the world looking for? The world is looking for the reform of all of these institutions. Because if we're honest, whether it's the UN, any of its specialized agencies and so forth, over the decades, world circumstances have changed, the number of states have changed, the kind of states have changed, the issues have changed, and all of these institutions require reform. They've become, in many ways, dysfunctional bureaucracies. Trump is right about that. They've become ineffective in one fashion or another. Some of them have actually become corrupt. People have helped themselves to the funds rather than using them and so forth. There is much criticism to go around for the global governance structure that has developed over 100, 150 years. But of course, what's called for is reform under the now contemporary circumstances, rather than getting rid of the system. And what the world badly is looking for is somebody, somewhere, whether it's the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of England or the head of state of China or whatever, to take some leadership and say, yes, these things aren't working properly anymore, but the thing to do is to put some new life into them, some new structure into them, to make something out of the system, because we can't just operate in an anarchy of 200 separate sovereign states. That is craziness. Finally, yes, I want to say that one of the things that was not mentioned at all this morning, and is most urgent in terms of looking at the global governance structure, are, well, actually two things. The first thing is that there are new issues. And the new issues are climate and climate change and technology. That wasn't even mentioned. And that is what badly needs institutionalization, organization, management, and so forth. All of these 200 odd or almost 200 sovereign states doing me first nationalism, right, is totally blind to the fact that a good chunk of these states will be underwater within 100 years, that the populations can't be fed because of global warming and agriculture not being able to feed the growing population. The crisis of the next 100 years are the consequences of climate change in a large part. And unless there's leadership in that, everything I've talked about is neither here nor there. It is absolutely neither here nor there. And the fact that that didn't even get a mention is a crisis of monumental proportion. Really, I cannot emphasize that enough. And adjacent to that is the question of technology, because it means national governance and global governance have to take account of the fact that every society, every state, every city, every individual is a porous beneficiary or victim to the technological changes that we're living in. The idea of every state doing its own thing when another state can help foster or control the elections inside that state, which is rapidly happening everywhere, or where cyber security becomes a major issue, where somebody from the outside can bring our entire energy grid to a grinding halt. We're talking about real issues and real crises, and those are not being addressed. So, on the one hand, we're talking about, we in the United States, talking about how the world has taken advantage of us and how we're going to now draw inside ourselves and look out for ourselves and manage our own affairs and not, care about these other people because they haven't shaped up, and don't you dare criticize the United States, because if you do, your funds will be cut off. We're shrinking foreign aid because we're only giving foreign aid to our friends. Our friends are largely people who don't need foreign aid. And, never mind other powers like China rising and India potentially rising. Either they're our friends or they're our enemies. And one day, last year, North Korea was Rocket Man. This year, North Korea is mentioned as a friend and as a wonderful leader and so forth. We can change our mind about these things, but you don't take into account that all of this is just, I would submit to you, fundamental nonsense, unless you take into account the notion that climate change, organizing that on a global scale, acting effectively worldwide, and not just in this country or that country, as well as technology, artificial intelligence, IT, cyber, and all of those things. Those are the issues of, if not your children, your grandchildren. And those did not even get a mention. Not a mention. It's like not on the American horizon. What we're worrying about is, how many indiscretions the next Supreme Court justice nominee has had, or, who attacked whom, and whether or not somebody in the Justice Department said, gee, if this continues, I better wear a wire the next time I see the president, and so forth. That is consuming us. But the genuine issues of the day really in the future are not consuming us. And that brings me to the next, final, before the break, small topic, and that is the erosion of democracy. Because the idea was that democracy would get us off these strange things and restore us to some kind of sanity. And the truth of the matter is that in all countries, all so-called democratic countries, you are now having right-wing and left-wing populism. You have moves away from what we would call liberal democracy and moves into so-called illiberal democracy. What's illiberal democracy? It is you go through the format. You have elections, but whoever comes on top in the election, whether just crookedly or non-crookedly, that person and that party and those individuals and those elites rule, and everybody is left behind. It is not surprising that all of us in this room who are well-educated and reasonably affluent and whatever, find it difficult to understand what alienation looks like, where people genuinely feel left behind in communities, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. And it is not surprising, but politically very dangerous, that these people should fall in line, whether it's 40% of the American electorate or 15% of somebody else's electorate, whether these people are falling in line with somebody who says, listen, it's those elite bastards who are causing that, or it's some other country that's causing it, or it's an ethnic group or a religious group that's causing it, and we want somebody who is going to take care of things. Whether it's Brexit, whether it's the right-wing government of Poland, whether it's the right-wing government of Israel, whether it's the authoritarian government of North Korea, or whatever. Right? So the fact that people are doing anti-liberal democratic things is not surprising. But then you could just flip it over and say, in order to address those issues, you can't just preach at people. You have to restore some of the order and some of the justice and some of all these other things we've talked about, because people are not insane, right? If I feel hopeless, then what's going to give me hope? Well, good leadership, but if leadership is illiberal, it will make my situation worse eventually, right? So we're living in a very dangerous time for so-called democracy, right? Time is up. You're right. We're living in a very dangerous time for global governments, for democracy, for internationalism, for all the values everybody in this room grew up with after the Second World War, right? And the question, of course, is what to do about it, et cetera, et cetera. So with that depressing bit, let's take a break and let's discuss these matters.
Sort of the sovereignty movement and anti-international, how are they viewed, what are they thinking, and what solutions do they propose to the problems we'll be creating by the erosion of the international institutions?
Yeah. Good question. It doesn't have a good response. The first problem is that, at least in the US at the moment, we do right, left, and center condemn expertise. Both on the right and the left, there are criticisms that the universities have been taken over by liberals, and from the left they're not liberal enough or politically correct enough, and from the right they're just incorrect, period. and that we shouldn't pay any attention to those people. Internationally, it depends on what country or which individuals. But in general, there is a lot of writing, especially about climate change, especially about international law, especially about the decline of the UN and so forth. And in general, the political actors internationally have been condemning these folks and their writing as being either irrelevant or not on target. So it's very different. I mean, if you read a journal like Foreign Affairs, which is not some lefty nutcase journal, it's used to be considered sort of representing the opinion of government elites and so forth. But if you read them, you get a lot of criticism, a lot of concern about the fraying of liberal democracy, a lot of discussion about all kinds of things, the lack of attention to climate change and so forth. But, you know, it's a very small group of people who read these things. And for them to morph, these kinds of views to morph into policy really requires that policy leaders take those things seriously. So, for example, the assault on expertise is not just in terms of scholars, but is also in terms of expertise inside the government in our country right now. Don't forget that the State Department has been hollowed out. Almost all the people who are expert on nuclear matters, particular countries, particular issues, they've all either retired or been fired. And so those folks have, you know, in many ways, for those of you who watch TV, you probably sometimes see a woman called Wendy Sherman, right? She's a retired American diplomat. She was very much at the forefront of the negotiation with Iran, right? And you can agree with her, you can disagree with her, but here's a woman who has been central to the negotiations over the Koreas. She's been central to the Iran negotiations. She knows a lot. And if you want to start thinking about things, first you have to be in contact with people who know a lot, and then you can form your own opinion. You don't have to necessarily echo their opinion. You just have to form your own opinion. Well, scholarly writings about these matters are not in the halls of our government these days. They really aren't, except for kind of a narrow band, the stuff that's acceptable in the Heritage Association or the Enterprise Institute and so forth. So, and the other thing is political. That is to say, populism, right and left, argues against expertise and argues against knowledge, because it's the expertise, the scholars, the writers, the knowledgeable people who have brought us the mess we're in. Right? The reason I'm unhappy, the reason I'm unemployed, the reason I'm alienated, the reason I'm surrounded by all these immigrants that speak strange languages that I want out of my country is because those folks have brought us this. Right? And so even amongst the general public, there is a kind of not wanting to pay too much attention to any of this stuff. So on the one hand, you're perfectly right. There's lots of writings and books and articles and so forth, but people aren't paying a whole lot of attention to it. And I think the most obvious topic here is climate change, right? I mean, human rights are more diverse, but it's climate change, where every scientist who's ever written a policy paper just about, where every political scientist who has looked at that stuff and written policy papers argues that the climate situation is absolutely dire and we need to attend to it. And you see these hurricanes coming and so forth, and everybody says, yes, yes, the world has always had hurricanes, but the magnitude of them today has something to do with the change of the atmosphere and the warming of the oceans and so forth and so on. Nobody's paying any attention. You don't want the expertise. right? And then, there is the historical, the big lie, whether it's Trump or it's Le Pen or it's the, I hope nobody hears Polish, but if you are, speak up, the disgusting government in Poland or Hungary or any of those folks, I'm going to listen to them. And they say this is not a problem. These are not problems. These are just, cuckoo birds in universities. Now, universities, I do think, have a lot to answer for, because I think universities have become corrupted, I say, as a retiree from a university. In many ways, and I won't spell out all the ways here, but including the fact that many academics who used to be considered objective now have one hand or one foot into some corporation or some startup or, some think tank or something, and are earning a fair chunk of their income from outside the university and are not considered that considered that objective anymore. So people have done themselves harm by marketing themselves into the marketplace of one kind or another. Now you can say, as poor academics, we've had a low income and we have low retirements and we have this, that, and the other thing. You can make all of those excuses, but the fact is, it undermines the reputation of people and the imagination that I may be corrupt, but you're not corrupt, and therefore they should listen to you. Right? It's very hard to get that across to politicians who make hay of it or for the general public. So yes and no. Long-winded answer. Yes, sir.
If we disregard Trump's current tariff approach to adjusting trade with China, what are your views as to what are the true trade problems with China? What rules are they transgressing? And what would be an approach other than tariffs to help correct that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because of course there are trade problems with China. So the ones that get most frequently mentioned, let's talk about those. One is that they steal technology, and the answer is yes, they have stolen a lot of technology. On the other hand, they're beginning to be ahead of us in a fair amount of technology. So the theft of the last 25 or 30 years is on the one hand declining, and on the other hand, one of these days we'll be stealing their technology because, for example, in artificial intelligence, they're way ahead of us. Or so I read. I'm not a technical person. So the other thing is that they manipulate currencies so that their goods are cheaper, and that is totally, totally unfair. Yes, the yen was what's the right word here? Undervalued, thank you. Was undervalued, and yes, they manipulated their currency, but it's not as undervalued anymore. In fact, it's not terribly undervalued anymore. So that has been to some extent rectified. So we're fighting old demons out there. And second of all, the manipulation of the currency has also, as a consequence or because of it, so in some ways, on the issue of monetary policy, on the issue of technology, while I won't claim that what the Chinese are doing is perfect, what I'm saying is that the problems that are out there highlighted politically by Trump and others have been radically reduced already. And it seems to me a more reasonable strategy is to, in negotiation, try to sort out the rest of it. Right? So that it's not, since they've been working on it themselves and have reasons, they have national reasons to work on it themselves because they're so overexposed in Asia and Latin America and everywhere else. So they themselves have economic issues which lead them to want to straighten some of these things out, and they are increasingly confident technologically, so they're having to do less theft. Now, in terms of the imbalance of trade, which is a third leg that's always discussed, that we have a trade deficit, right? They sell us more than we sell them. That's very complicated. And are there economists here? Because it depends on how you calculate the trade deficit, as I understand it. If you calculate it in terms of goods, it comes out one way. If you calculate it in terms of goods and services and other investments, it's not as serious. Right? So generally speaking, the trade imbalance has become very complicated, in part because of what I just said, and in part because so much production of goods is made in bits and pieces in different countries. So that how you calculate which part of my shoe is made there and which is here and which is sewn somewhere else makes it pretty difficult to calculate what the actual imbalance is. So it seems to me that the economists that are looking at it and saying, yes, there is some trade imbalance, but it's not half as serious as it's being made out. And in and of itself, because of the way that things are sorted out, it is sorting itself out slowly over time. A fourth leg of this has to do with absolute disadvantages that the U.S. suffers on some particular item. For example, the whole business with Canada over milk and cheese and whatever, and wood products, I guess. It's true that the Canadians have protected their industries, their small industries, and there is no denying that that's the case. So if you were a milk producer or cheese producer in the United States, you could say, well, I'm disadvantaged here. On the other hand, if you look at additional goods and other things that are sold, very often the U.S. is an advantage, right? Canada and the U.S. are each other's biggest trading partners, right? So if you just take one item, it's not difficult to say, well, there, you know, we need to be critical. Or if you take one item or a bunch of items with China, you say, well, there is a problem. The question is, how do you, first of all, are the problems exaggerated or out of date? And the second thing is, if there are problems, are you better off having a trade war, which makes the whole system collapse, or are you better negotiating more favorable terms over years, which make the situation more equitable? That's my long-winded, it's not very satisfactory response, but I just want to keep it complicated. Yes, back there. Yes, you.
So it just seems to me that today's topic of Trump at the UN just seems to crystallize the fact that it seems as though we've almost stopped doing policy in the United States, and we're sort of reacting to a bunch of different things just on the fly. Is there policy that's going on somewhere that we don't see, or?
It's hidden. Well, first I want to say, next time I'm going to talk about foreign policy and foreign policy making as a subject, right? That was advertised, so I promise not to do the whole session on Trump, although he will come up. The second thing is, of course, we're making domestic policies very rapidly, and some of you might like them and others might not like them. So you're really, in a sense, zeroing in on foreign policy. Do we have foreign policy? Yes, we have foreign policy, but it's screwy foreign policy. That is to say, on the one hand, our policy is to have less policy. That is to say, we simply, America first, isolationism. Isolation is a policy, but it means a disengaged policy, right? So that is a policy. And he mentioned, a lot of mention is made of isolationism nowadays. America first is essentially an isolationist policy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we pick and choose, and the policies are sort of haywired, right? I mean, if you listened last year, you decided the absolute worst people that we're never ever going to talk to and probably bomb into smithereens is North Korea. And now all of a sudden our policy is that North Korea leader is actually a really good chap and everything is going to be ironed out with him. In both cases, they're policies, right? And one of the things that has happened is that we do, almost 360-degree turnarounds on various kinds of policies. One day, when I'm in the UN, I'm willing to talk to anybody, so I want to talk to the head that's arriving of state from Iran. Because if I can talk to North Korea, I can talk to Iran. Then yesterday evening and this morning, I'm certainly not going to talk to them unless they change their entire government, their entire policies, their entire everything else. So the policies very often come across as revisionist from day to day and helter-skelter. Normally, and as I said, I'll talk about this in some detail next time, there is a process by which policy is made. And that has also been disrupted. And I'll spell that out next time. So that a lot of times, the president gets up in the morning and he has a policy idea. It hasn't been vetted, right? And serious governments normally don't make policy this way. And one of the things that has happened in the world is that not only has American leadership been torn into smithereens, is that every government in the world, whether it's authoritarian or democratic or whatnot, has decided that you can't pay very much attention to the daily policy announcements because they're so crazy. I mean, quite literally, I don't think there's a leader in the world that doesn't think U.S. policy right now is crazy. Right? Which of course means you have very little influence. Because what we've essentially given away, which was very intangible, which was American influence and American respect, right? People didn't always agree with us. I mean, people criticize us, I think justifiably, but there can be a difference of opinion on, let's say, the Vietnam War, or us getting out of the Iran treaty, or whatever the case may be. There's been serious disagreement with specific American policy. But up until, fairly recently, there was the idea that we could disagree here, there, and yonder, but we look to America as some leadership, not intellectual leadership, but also policy leadership and so forth. And that has been completely given up. I mean, you can talk to any head of state, and they would tell you in private, they're not going to say it in public, they're going to take it in public, that what's going on right now in the U.S. is absolutely crazy. Right? And that includes our best friends, right? Not just enemies. So that essentially means that if we got around to wanting to affect something, the only thing we have to really affect a major change or major influence is to actually use force. And the president said this morning that we are proud that we are spending more on the military than we've ever spent before in my administration. We're building up the military. So, of course, this is not illogical, right? What you're saying is you're going to isolate yourself. You're going to have a hard border. You're not wanting to do have very much to do with any interdependence with others. You're going to not be respectful of your commitments to international institutions. And therefore, the only way you can get anybody to do what you want them to do is through force. That's getting back to gunboat diplomacy. I mean, not literally, but So, in point of fact, saying on the one hand we're going to isolate ourselves, and on the other hand to say, and we're building up our military, by the way. You should all take note. We're spending more than we've ever spent before, and we're getting more competent in our military. If you were a leader of any country, what would you think about that? Right?
Better go nuts.
Yes.
Not to be looking for conspiracy things or anything, but looking at the process, I find it hard to believe that Trump came up with this on his own as a leader. So what are the processes, if you look at the polls, whatever you think of polls, most of them show that the American citizens have a pretty low opinion of Trump and the Congress, and yet he's, there's something feeding his ideas, like is it Bannon, is it a group? Where is this coming from?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So, without being conspiratorial, what's the process here? How does he get to what he's doing and saying and so forth? Hard to answer. There is, in certain policies, I can identify for you whose policy that is. It's John Bolton's, for example, right? The anti-immigration stuff is Mr. Miller in his administration. Some things are hangovers from Bannon, right? So you can, in different policies, you can trace who might have planted some ideas in his head. So that's possible. But on the other hand, of course, you have to be receptive. You can tell me to jump off the bridge, and if I don't want to jump off the bridge, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to say the lady's crazy, right? Let her jump off the bridge, right? So that's part of it. The other thing is that a lot of what he's surrounding himself with people that in some senses resonate with his own instincts, with his own feelings, with his own worldview. That is to say, I don't think his worldview is entirely informed by other people. He does have a worldview, and he's had that worldview for a long time. And the people he's hung out with have had that worldview for a long time. His father had that worldview, for heaven's sake. So in some senses, he is a sponge for this stuff, right? And so he gets advice, and he listens to that advice. So that's number one. Number two, it's his own instincts. And number three, sometimes, I think it's not rational at all. He gets up in the morning, and he says to himself, how dare the head of government and so forth have criticized the U.S. last night? I'm just going to tell them that you don't criticize the U.S. And so that's the end of it. So I think it's a combination.
So some argue that this speaks to the trade issue, for example, that many of these countries need us more than we need them because we have such a big market. So are they really facing kind of making a pragmatic money decision versus their national pride, loyal, sovereignty? Will people actually give up a chance for trade to kind of maintain their national integrity?
What's that? Do I have to repeat that? Do you all hear it? Do other countries, after all, the U.S. is a big trading partner, for example, and has been a big influence militarily and so forth, and do other people just give that all up, or do they make compromises, or whatever they do? It's very hard to answer that generally because it depends on the country. Some countries are in a position to just do their own thing more. That is to say, find alternatives to the U.S. Some countries are dependent on the U.S. For example, if you're importing food, let's say, and you need to import food for grains, let's say, or soybeans or whatever, right? And let's say we put too much tariff on soybeans, so our soybean farmers can't sell it to China anymore. Okay. So fortunately for China, there are alternate places it can get its soybeans. But let's imagine that somebody doesn't have something alternate. Well, of course, they make compromises. That is to say, their agricultural minister still deals with the farmers and so forth in the hopes that Trump will go away eventually, and they paper it over in some ways. Some governments are in the position, because they're affluent enough or flexible enough, to reallocate things from their budgets, which, let's say, help farmers grow more. Underserved. Or this is very harmful to the environment. They reduce the various environmental policies to allow people to use chemicals again so they could grow them. So it's so complicated in terms of what kind of bargains countries make. And some countries, for example, Iran right now, are deciding that for their survival as a government and their policies and so forth, they're going to allow their people to suffer more, and which is exactly what the Iranians are doing, right? Similarly with Russia, Russia just decides, well, so the Russians have suffered a lot for decades, they could suffer some more, right? And so forth. So people make very different trade-offs, and you almost have to go specific policy area, I mean, specific economic policy, and a specific country. It is also the case that quite a lot of countries over the last decade anyway, have become more affluent, right? The absolute poverty has been reduced and so forth. And you can't say that that's been entirely due to American largesse or trade. Very often they themselves have managed to become more productive in one fashion or another. But I wouldn't want to whitewash this at all and say that leaders who want to be principals aren't going to suffer. I mean, principle doesn't mean necessarily good principle. It could be a bad principle, but that allow their populations to suffer by simply saying we're not going to be dealing with this in one way or the other. In any event, what it does do is change the domestic policies of those politics of those countries, which is why when there's difficulties, populism reemerges in one fashion or another, and the population that suffers gets more unhappy and tends to elect crazy people, etc., etc. So I don't want to disaggregate the political consequences of the very good question you're raising from the economic immediate consequences. Yes?
In light of your comments about sovereign states and in light of your comments about climate change, what do you think of the trend of the state of California defying the federal government? And is that a trend nationwide?
Good question. The meetings in San Francisco a week ago weren't just attended by Americans. They were also attended by mayors and governors and so forth of other states. In many parts of the world, local entities of one kind or another are saying either the government isn't out front enough on climate change, or we have other issues, and we're going to do our own thing. Now, doing your own thing doesn't necessarily mean you address the magnitude of climate change, but you're making a little contribution, right? If you and I don't pollute or throw, plastic around, we're not going to change in climate change. It makes us feel better, but it doesn't just make us, you and me, feel better. It also means we're more inclined to vote for somebody who also thinks the same way. So there again, it spills over into the political universe in some fashion. Now, the second part of your question is, will it make any difference? Well, California is the sixth largest, seventh largest economy in the world. What it does fifth largest, can make a pretty big difference, right? So California is a larger economy than many of the states in the world. So from the perspective of can California make an impact, the answer is obviously yes. And so California leadership is a good thing. Is it happening nationwide? No. Not at the state level. And don't forget, so many governors in the various U.S. states right now are Republicans who are going along with the idea that, it's just crazy lefties who have all this environmental stuff and so forth. On the other hand, some people, I'll get back to you in a minute, some people are pushing it. For example, the perfectly Republican and otherwise not particularly forward-thinking governor of Florida has noticed that there is an environmental problem in Florida. And so he has, in fact, taken some, what one would call lefty positions on the environment. So in that sense, what you see is that localities have a self-interest very often, and whether they can do something about it very quickly is a separate question. China actually has a fairly advanced environmental policies, but the magnitude of their problems are such that there is no way they can morph from their polluting use of coal, let's say, to clean energy within 2 or 3 years. years. I mean, it's going to take decades. The problems in India are almost more serious right now than they are in China. And, you get quaint things like the Modi, the head of the Indian government right now, saying, well, one thing we can do, and that is to provide toilets all over, because Indians typically, is there any Indian person here, often tend not to want to use toilets. They're used to relieving themselves outside, and they kind of like that. So Modi decided that this was a big environmental contribution to the world and to India, is to start distributing toilets locally. So they started distributing them, and people then had a toilet to use in their house or their compound or whatever. And then they decided not to use them, because they preferred relieving themselves outside. So there you need a cultural change, not just a behavioral change, but a cultural change. So there again, you get incredible complexities. Is it a good idea for California to try to take the lead? Sure. I'm sorry, follow up, yeah.
Yeah, my question was as much about that as about states possibly breaking away from the United States. There's some trends, some other trends in other states
Well, when I was in graduate school, we were going to separate Northern and Southern California. I don't think the U.S. is about to break up. I don't even think Canada is about to break up, in spite of Quebec and liberation. Other states that are the consequences of colonialism that I talked about earlier, where, for example, right now you're having a huge conflict in the Cameroons. You don't know where the Cameroons are? Equatorial Africa, West Africa, below. This is just a funny aside, allow me. When I was an undergraduate, I wrote my honors thesis on the plebiscite over the Cameroons, because the idea was that the English part of Cameroons, which had been governed with Nigeria, should it become part of a single country with French-speaking Cameroons, which was part of French colonialism. And the plebiscite took place, and they all voted to be one country. And I studied this mess. And right now, the English-speaking part of the Cameroons is fighting to separate from the French-speaking Cameroons. That's what happened in 50 years or more. So there are all kinds of people that want out of the countries they're in. They want to separate, there's separatist movements everywhere, from Spain in Europe to every imaginable place. And generally speaking, what political scientists have to say about that is that when people get treated fairly and are not discriminated against, they're generally willing to be part of the whole. That's elastic idea, because, am I being treated fairly if somebody is telling me that I should speak the national language and not my local language? How easy is it to promote bilingualism through education and so forth? So it gets incredibly complicated for people to separate out, but that does not mean that there's not a lot of separatism going on right now, which responds to your question. And the separatism could vary, if one allowed all the separatist movements to become separate states between now and Christmas, we would have 400 sovereign states rather than 200. And imagine the messiness of the world right now and what it will look like when there are 400 or 500 or whatever running around. Large states like India could split up in any number of ways, as could many other states. Part of the idea of having global governance was to honor differences while at the same time allowing people to live under a single umbrella. And as populists arise in various countries, there is more risk than what you're suggesting of happening. Whether it's going to happen or not, I can't say. But certainly some new states will come into being in the next decade, I would think. Have we exhausted this? Yes?
To what extent have the corporations played a part in either supporting Trump or getting him elected?
Hard to say, because lots of corporations put tons of money into the Trump campaign. Whether that swayed the general public, how much that money bought him in terms of votes, probably a lot, right? It's the Citizen United business that you've all heard about, right? Which allowed corporations to be treated like persons, and therefore they could, contribute anything they wanted. I would say, generally speaking, unless we get some of the money out of politics, the future of American politics is not very bright. I mean, it's not a direct answer to your question, but it kind of is, actually. The corporate executives themselves were all on board after Trump got elected. You remember those meetings of all the corporate executives standing out? Well, quite a few of them have dropped out. And the reason quite a few of them have dropped out is because various domestic and international policies are going counter to their interests. I mean, imagine yourself being a corporate executive of the American automobile industry right now. Every car is put together through bits and pieces, made in Mexico, made in Canada, made here, there, and yonder. And now Trump comes along with a trade war, right? Which means one of two things. Either you're going to have less of a profit if you keep your prices, or you're going to turn the losses that you are incurring back to the consumer. So all of a sudden, we're all going to be paying $5,000 more to buy a car. Right? Well, they're afraid of doing that because you and I might be driving older and older cars rather than getting new cars. So their bottom line is going to be reduced. So if you were the president of any of these corporations that are being affected by the trade war, you might have second thoughts by now. Not all of them, but some of them, I would think. Yes, sir.
When you talked about, the structure of the forming of the states and the different organizations and so on, but one thing I didn't hear you mention, and I'm wondering how this has affected the whole thing, is what about the rise of organized terrorist groups? How does all that...
How do organized terrorist groups... First of all, there have been organized terrorist groups as long as we have history, believe it or not. There's a wonderful book by Hobsbawm, who is an English historian sociologist, called Primitive Rebels. And I think it was written in the 60s or 70s. And he describes terrorists organizations throughout history in Europe and so forth. What makes terrorism seem so new, right? And therefore your question is that, of course, with contemporary communications and contemporary means of chemical warfare and all kinds of other military or semi-military use, terrorists have become much more dangerous and much more global, international, rather than just, let's say, the mafia in Italy, right? Now the mafia spilled out of Italy as well, but not badly so. But nowadays you have, the Middle East terrorists and all the whatever terrorists around the world. It's a problem. But and I'm not trying to diminish the importance of terrorism having freaked people out, and therefore having arguments for isolationism, hard borders, because Trump, among other things, talked about that this morning. He talked about, we're going to have hard borders and making sure these gangs and criminals and so forth stay out. He, of course, attached it to immigrants. right? We're going to keep these people out because they're gang members, they're terrorists, blah, blah, blah. As a matter of fact, immigrants have a lower crime rate than native-born Americans, but never mind that reality. But most of them coming in. It's really, really dangerous. We got to stop this. They're going to stop coming in. And instead of having, 45,000 refugees being absorbed in the U.S., we're only going to have 20,000 next year, and maybe not even that many. Right? We haven't even reached this year's larger quota because we won't let them in. Because they're all terrorists and they all endanger us. Well, yes and no. The people that have died from terrorism are minuscule compared to the people that have died, for example, in Myanmar without terrorism. The terrorists are not always foreigners. Many terrorists are actually domestic terrorists in whatever country they happen to be in this country and in other countries. And here I want to say something that might be slight off the point of your question, which is, if you're concerned about terrorism, which we all are, and we all should be, the question is, what creates terrorists in the long term? And I would submit to you that we're doing everything in our power in the Middle East, in various countries, in Iran, in Gaza, in everything. I would find it imaginable that 20% of you, if you were teenagers in Gaza, would aspire to becoming terrorists. Why not? That makes a lot of sense, to be a terrorist. So the part of the problem about terrorism is how to minimize it, and one of the ways to minimize it is not to execute larger foreign policies which are, likely to generate terrorism. And second, to not make terrorism into the politics that it's become for populists to then say, and therefore we will become isolationist, therefore we will protect ourselves, therefore we won't allow immigrants and refugees in anymore because those are the guys that make us unsafe. I think the more we close the U.S. border, by the way, the more terrorism we're actually going to have. Because if I'm a Somali in Minneapolis, and I am part of an immigrant family, and I might have even been born in Minneapolis, and I learn that A, I'm discriminated against on my racial grounds, B, that the President of the United States considers my people as terrorists, C, that my relatives, my siblings, my grandmother can no longer hope to come to the United States, and D, I might be unemployed or underemployed, I might think terrorism might be what I should be doing. And if all of those things didn't exist, I might meld in the way in previous generations, Germans and Poles and so forth melded in. That is to say, if you attack people and you attack their people and you diminish their feelings of either belonging to the country, if you discriminate against them, if you're racist, if for example, you stop hitting Muslims over the head, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in France, what you do to the younger generation is make terrorism a meaningful alternative. If you were accepted, you're not, people who feel accepted, people who feel okay about themselves are less likely to be violent against themselves and others. And so by this anti-Islam thing, by this racism, by this anti-Iranian business, for example, you're in a sense growing terrorism. So if one is interested in diminishing it, we're following, it seems to me, the absolute wrong policies, not just in the United States, other countries as well, France and other countries. So, and even, a country like Sweden, right? Has never had any terrorism. Part of the terrorism in Scandinavia has come from native-born people with no origin, like the Norwegian guy and so forth and so on, right? They're neo-Nazis and so forth. But also, I think, by discriminating against the immigrants, by making their lives, not only their lives difficult in an economic sense, but by not honoring their ancestors, their relatives, and so forth, and diminishing them. You create, people who say to themselves, what do I have to lose? Let me become a terrorist. On that awful sad note, see you next time.